The fog over the North Sea on the morning of 5th November 1940 is thick enough to taste, a cold, metallic brine that clings to the skin and muffles sound until the world shrinks to the gray walls of water immediately surrounding each ship. 40 miles southeast of Newfoundland, the armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay steams at the heart of Convoy HX-84, a sprawling formation of 38 merchantmen packed with timber, steel, food, and aviation fuel, the lifeblood of a besieged Britain. The Jervis Bay is not a warship, not really. She is a former passenger liner, a 14,000-ton vessel pressed into service, her elegant lines now marred by the hasty addition of 7 obsolete 6-inch guns, relics from a previous war. Her captain is a man named Edward Stephen Fogarty Fegan, a 51-year-old officer with a face weathered by 4 decades at sea and the calm, unshakable demeanor of a man who understands duty down to his bones. He stands on the open bridge, scanning the horizon, knowing full well that his ship is a lamb in wolf's clothing, a cruiser in name only, tasked with protecting this flock against predators of unimaginable power. The Admiralty has warned them, a German raider is loose in these waters, but warnings are one thing, the stark, brutal reality is quite another. At 1650 hours, the silence is ripped apart. A lookout's cry cuts through the wind, and every man on the Jervis Bay turns to starboard. There, emerging from a haze on the horizon, is a silhouette that freezes the blood. It is not a cruiser, not a destroyer. It is a monster. The German pocket battleship Admiral Scheer has found them. At over 12,000 tons and armed with 6 11-inch guns that can outrange and outgun anything the convoy possesses, she is a ship killer, a steel leviathan designed for this exact purpose, to hunt and destroy convoys. For the next hour, in the gathering dusk of the North Atlantic, one of the most astonishing, selfless, and strategically brilliant deceptions in naval history will unfold. A desperate gamble that will see a forgotten British captain use nothing but his ship, his courage, and a single clever trick to make a German battleship believe it is facing an entire fleet, saving 31 of the 37 ships under his protection. It is a story not of brute force, but of psychological warfare, of a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the illusion of strength. To understand the sheer audacity of what Fegan was about to attempt, one must first grasp the terrifying strategic equation of the North Atlantic in 1940. Britain stood alone. The Nazi war machine had crushed Europe, and the only thing preventing Hitler from crossing the Channel was the Royal Navy and the tenuous supply lines stretching across the ocean. Every convoy was a lifeline. The Admiral Scheer, under the command of Captain Theodore Kronke, was one of the Kriegsmarine's most potent commerce raiders. Fast, heavily armored, and with a range that could keep her at sea for months, she was the embodiment of a nightmare. Her 11-inch guns could hurl a 300-kilogram shell over 20 miles, accurate enough to pick off a freighter from beyond the horizon. Against such a foe, the Jervis Bay was laughably inadequate. Her guns, of a type fitted to destroyers in the previous war, had a maximum range of just over 10,000 yards. In a straight fight, the outcome was not in doubt. It was a mathematical certainty. The official Admiralty instructions for an armed merchant cruiser, upon encountering a superior force, were that they were to use their speed to attempt escape and preserve their own vessel. They were not expected to sacrifice themselves. They were not built for it. But Fegan looked at his pitiful armament, at the 38 freighters behind him laden with supplies for a starving, fighting nation, and he chose a different path. He chose to attack. This is where the clever trick begins, a ruse so simple yet so profoundly effective that it hinged entirely on the psychology of the enemy commander. Fegan knew he could not sink the Scheer, he knew he could not even realistically damage her, but he also knew something else. The commander of a German pocket battleship, a vessel of immense national prestige and material value, could not afford to take risks. Kronke, peering through his own binoculars, saw the Jervis Bay turn not away, but directly towards him, belching black smoke as her engines were forced to their maximum. From the German perspective, this made no sense. Why would a lone, obsolete cruiser charge a battleship? The only logical conclusion, the only explanation that fitted the tactical situation, was that she was not alone. She must be the escort for a trap, the bait for a hidden battle fleet just over the horizon. Figen's entire plan was to exploit this hesitation, to sow a single seed of doubt in the German captain's mind. His ship was not a weapon of destruction, but a canvas upon which he painted a masterpiece of deception. The technical details of this desperate charge were in themselves unremarkable, but the human drama unfolding on the decks of the Jervis Bay turned them into legend. Figen ordered the convoy to scatter, a desperate measure that sent the freighters fleeing in all directions like a flock of birds, making them harder to hunt but leaving them utterly defenseless. Then he ordered his own ship on a collision course with the enemy. He needed to close the distance, to get within the pitifully short range of his own guns, but more importantly, he needed to get between the sheer and the fleeing ships. As the Jervis Bay steamed towards the enemy, the first salvo from the sheer screamed across the water. The 11-inch shells landed with the force of an earthquake, sending plumes of water hundreds of feet into the air. Figen held his course. A second salvo straddled the ship, steel splinters tearing through the superstructure. Still, he pressed on. The third salvo found its mark. A direct hit destroyed the bridge, killing or wounding everyone on it, except Figen, who was blown into the wreckage below. He climbed back to a lower, exposed navigation platform, his right arm shattered and hanging uselessly at his side. He took command again, giving orders through the chaos, his voice calm. For nearly an hour, the Jervis Bay continued to steam directly at the German battleship, firing her ineffective 6-inch guns, the flashes from her muzzles the only reply to the thunderous explosions tearing her apart. The steering was gone, the ship was on fire from bow to stern, and the deck was a slaughterhouse. But Figen kept her moving, kept her fighting, kept her between the sheer and the scattering convoy. He knew her ship was dying, he knew his men were dying, but every minute he stayed afloat was another minute of safety for the freighters. The trick was working. The psychological impact on the German crew must have been profound. Here was a ship that should have surrendered, should have run, yet it came on with a suicidal ferocity that defied explanation. Kranke, watching through his rangefinders, saw this burning wreck continuing to fire, continuing to close the distance. What manner of navy was this? What other surprises lay in wait? He kept his powerful ship at long range, engaging the Jervis Bay with his main armament, rather than closing in to finish her quickly and pursue the merchants. He was cautious, professional, and utterly deceived. The Royal Navy had not sent a cruiser to do a battleship's job. They had sent a man who understood that the threat of force could be as potent as force itself. Figen had transformed his doomed ship into a symbol, a statement, a trick that held a Nazi battleship at bay while its prey escaped into the safety of the gathering darkness. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. These are the stories that slip through the cracks of history, the tales of ingenuity and sacrifice that remind us that war is not always won by the biggest gun, but sometimes by the sharpest mind and the bravest heart. Finally, as flames engulfed his ship and the list became so severe that the guns could no longer be brought to bear, Figen gave the order to abandon ship. It was 1750 hours, just under an hour after the first shot was fired. The Jervis Bay, a blazing torch in the gray Atlantic, slipped beneath the waves. Figen went down with her, last seen on the remnants of his bridge, a shattered man holding on to a rail, ensuring his crew had every possible chance to escape. His body was lost to the sea, but his plan had succeeded beyond all reasonable measure. Of the 38 ships in Convoy HX-84, only 5 were eventually found and sunk by the Admiral Scheer. 31 escaped, their crews, their cargoes, and their hope saved by a man who traded his life for theirs. Figen was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the citation reading, "for valor in challenging hopeless odds and giving his life to save the many ships it was his duty to protect." When you compare this action to other naval encounters of the period, its uniqueness becomes starkly apparent. This was not a duel of equals, like the pursuit of the Bismarck, nor a planned ambush like the attack on the Tirpitz. It was an impromptu, almost instinctive act of strategic deception. Compare Figan's trick to the later psychological victory at the River Plate, where Commodore Harwood used bluff and misinformation to convince Captain Langsdorff of the Graf Spee that a superior force awaited him outside Montevideo harbor. That was a slow-burn deception, orchestrated over days via radio and diplomatic channels. Figan's trick was instantaneous, a visual lie told with the only currency he had, his ship and his courage. The Americans, with their sophisticated radar and air power later in the war, would rarely need to resort to such desperate measures. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, possessed no equivalent to the Jervis Bay. They had no vessel designed to be a sacrifice, no doctrine that called for a captain to knowingly steam his ship to annihilation. In that disparity lay the fundamental difference between a navy that fought for conquest and one that fought for survival. The legacy of that November afternoon is complex and multi-layered. In purely material terms, the loss of the Jervis Bay was in. The legacy of that November afternoon is complex and multi-layered. In purely material terms, the loss of the Jervis Bay was insignificant, but her loss and the manner of it became a propaganda triumph for the British. Churchill himself would later speak of Captain Figan VC and other Irish heroes in a speech about the spirit of the Allied cause. The story of the lone cruiser charging a battleship to save the convoy became a metaphor for Britain's entire war effort, defiant, outgunned, but utterly unwilling to yield. Psychologically, the effect on the Kriegsmarine was a reinforcement of their deepest fears about the Royal Navy's aggression. They had witnessed firsthand an action that defied their own military logic. It made them more cautious, more prone to overestimate the threat posed by escorts, and less willing to press home attacks. The Admiral Scheer continued her raiding cruise with some success, but the seed of doubt planted by Figan's charge lingered. He had proven that a determined captain could, with a clever trick, neutralize a vastly superior force for the critical minutes needed to save a convoy. Return to that cold, darkening ocean, now scattered with lifeboats and debris. The men of the Jervis Bay bob in the freezing swells, watching their burning ship slide away. They are cold, they are shocked, they are mourning their captain and their shipmates, but around them, in the gloom, they can see the dim shapes of freighters, dozens of them steaming hard for the horizon, for safety, for home. Their captain's trick has worked. He painted a picture of strength so convincing that a battleship flinched. He took a hopeless hand and played it with such audacity that the enemy blinked first. Captain Edward Figan did not sink the Admiral Scheer. He did not fire the shot that won the war, but on the 5th of November 1940, he taught the world a lesson about the power of a single, clever trick wielded by a man who understood that courage, in its purest form, is the ultimate deception. It is the illusion that you are not afraid, that you will not stop, that you are not alone. And sometimes that is enough.